We're starting a new series of lessons today on the life of Joseph in the Old Testament. A series that's called The Pit, Prison, and Palace. And during the rest of the month of June, I think we're going to realize that the major theme of this series is going to be God's providence and His timing. God's providence in Joseph's life and how the Lord works in the lives of His people throughout different seasons and different chapters, just like how Erin Burney on Friday evening, graduating from Topsail High School, finished a chapter, and now she's beginning a brand new chapter of her life. You should be scared, but it seems like you don't care, so you're going to eat a lot of Hot Pockets. There was a season in my life when I ate a lot of Hot Pockets. I was working the third shift at a hospital, and it's all I ate was Hot Pockets, and now I can't stand the sight of them. So, Hot Pockets, they're either like burning lava hot, that's what Jim Gaffigan says, or like frozen in the middle. Hot Pocket. When we look at the biblical concept of predestination, and we did that back in September, you might remember we talked about God's providence and His timing. God is completely sovereign. He is in control, and we have the free will to make choices and decisions. God is in control, but He is not controlling. We can choose how we're going to live our lives, seeking God in faith. And we choose how we respond when things out of our control happen to us or happen to the people that we love, trusting that God is working and moving in the different chapters of our lives. You might be surprised to know that the account of Joseph's life, it takes up more space in the book of Genesis than any other one person in that book. More space is given to Joseph than to Adam and Eve. More space is given to Joseph than to Noah, to his great-grandfather Abraham, Isaac, even to his own dad, Jacob, Israel. In this series, we are going to be looking at one of the ancient patriarchs whose presence in history, it greatly impacts the landscape of Jewish history and, more importantly, God's plan of redemption and salvation. Joseph's biography, it can be broken down into three segments, or at least we're using three segments for this series. The first segment is from when he was born in Genesis chapter 30 to when he was 17 years old in Genesis chapter 37. And guess where our teenage boy, Joey, guess where he ends up? In a pit. During this season of his life, we could say that Joseph's family was in transition. Everyone was unsettled and on the move, and they were doing crazy, crazy things. And there was this constant antagonism that was brewing in his family during this period of time. And this is where we're going to spend a good chunk of our time today. We're going to set the stage for this chapter of Joseph's life leading up to the pit. And we're going to be talking openly. We're going to be talking honestly about dysfunctional families, messed up families, jacked up families. Maybe you can relate. Some of you are like, right? Looking at the person next to you. My mom got married this past Saturday, and I can tell you some fun things about my dysfunctional family, but I won't do that. That would be wrong. The second segment of Joseph's life, the second chapter that we're going to look at is from age 17 to 30 years old. And during this season of life, Joseph reaches manhood. I'm a man. I'm 30, right? That's what he said. Unfortunately, his life takes some very hard turns as he faces enslavement and unfair accusations, and guess where he ends up? In a prison. The final chapter that we're going to look at, and it's a big chapter, it's the last 80 years of his life, age 30 until death. Genesis chapters 41 through 50. Joseph's last 80 years are years of prosperity and reward under God's blessing. We're going to see that he had the power, he had an opportunity to get even, to take some revenge on his messed up family, but he forgave. And he blessed them instead. And we're given this powerful verse there at the very end of the book of Genesis. You did this to harm me, but God intended it for good. It's the definition of God's providence. Where is Joseph during this season? He's in a palace. I think in order to really jump into the life of Joseph, we have to understand the dysfunctional family that he was born into. Being a part of a family is the most interesting dynamic of life, isn't it? For real, I want you to think for a moment about your family. The family that you were born into, maybe the family that you married into, right? I see some smiles. I see some frowns, see people shaking their heads, happy thoughts, angry thoughts. Everybody take a deep breath. It's going to be okay. How was church this morning? Well, I was doing fine until Matt told me to think about my family. There is an old saying that says you can pick your friends and you can pick your nose, but you shouldn't pick your friends. That's the wrong quote. Sorry about that. That was Socrates. The quote that we're all familiar with is, you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your family. No one gets a choice about what family they are born into. Jeff Foxworthy once said, if you ever start feeling like you have the craziest, most dysfunctional family in the world, all you have to do is go to the state fair. Because 5 minutes at the fair, and then you'll be thinking to yourself, you know what, we're not too bad. Hey, buddy, I like the fair. Joseph was born into an insanely dysfunctional family. Joseph's father was the patriarch Jacob. We worked through a series of sermons last summer looking at the life of Jacob called Death to Selfie. And I mentioned it earlier. What was Jacob's other name? Israel. Yeah, which means wrestling with God, struggling with God. It was a name that was given to him after he wrestled with the Lord and he held on to get that blessing. God was like, zip it or I'll break your hip. The name Israel is a big-time improvement over his original name, Jacob, which literally meant deceiver. Joseph's dad, Israel, he himself was born into a family where there was a lot of deception and a lot of favoritism and jealousy and bitterness. His dad's older twin brother, his uncle Esau, was favored by his dad, Grandpa Isaac, while Jacob was favored by his mom, Grandma Rebecca. Isaac and Rebecca had their favorites. And you might remember Jacob cheated his brother out of his birthright and then later cheated him out of his blessing with the help of his mama. And like it happens so often with us humans, Jacob, he didn't learn anything from his family's mistakes when it came to rivalry and jealousy and favoritism. And the cycle of brokenness continued from generation down to generation. You know, we can easily take a look at our families, especially our parents, and we can think and we can say things like, I'm not going to do that when I'm older. Right? When I'm a dad, when I'm a mom, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be like that. And then we end up doing the same exact thing. Deception, lies, envy, favoritism. Well, Joseph's dad, Jacob, like it goes, he fell in love with a girl named Rachel. The Bible says that she was smoking hot. And so Jacob works 7 years for Rachel's father in order to be able to marry her. But guess what? Rachel's dad tricked Jacob, and you might remember this. He slipped in Rachel's older and less attractive sister, Leah, slipped her in as Jacob's bride. Jacob married the wrong woman. This would be a great Netflix original series. Jacob got angry. You think? I don't want to marry her. So Rachel and Leah's dad said, hey, you can marry Rachel, but you got to work another 7 years for me, big boy. And Jacob does that. But Leah, the unloved wife, she begins to have children for Jacob almost right away. And over the next 10 years, Leah and Jacob had 7 children, 6 sons and 1 daughter. Rachel, however, was not able to have children, which was the greatest stigma for a woman in that culture. And as a result of Leah and Rachel's competition for Jacob's affection and their rivalry for motherhood, they got some other women involved, and Jacob had 4 other sons with his wives' servants. So Jacob had 11 children, but none with his favorite wife, none with his beloved Rachel. This is the picture of Joseph's dad and mom and aunt or stepmoms or whatever you want to call them, his uncle, grandparents, half-brothers. Craziness. Like I mentioned, my mom got married this past Saturday, and it feels really weird saying that. I now have a stepdad, and I have a stepbrother, and I have a stepsister. It's crazy. For those of you who don't know, my mom and dad were married for 44 years before my father passed away. And the man that my mom married, his name's Roy, he was married for 48 years before his wife passed away. It was a very, very nice wedding ceremony. Two dysfunctional families coming together. Mom and Roy, they spent this past week in Myrtle Beach. And so I took Macy and Owen down to crash their honeymoon. Honeymoon crashers. Like, we're coming down, we're going to swim in the pool, swim in the ocean. Macy and most of her cousins, I would say, they call him Papa Roy, which that just naturally happened and has a good ring to it. He said I could call him anything, just don't call him late to dinner. So, okay. When we were at Myrtle Beach hanging out with them for the day, Owen was cracking me up because he kept getting his words mixed up. And he was like, Uncle Roy, watch this. Hey, Uncle Roy, check this out. And Owen was doing like a cannonball or something in the pool. And I'm like, hey, dude, he's not your uncle. Arrested Development, uncle, father, grandfather. Okay, back to the great nation that God had promised Joseph's great-grandfather, Abraham. After all of this drama, God allows Rachel to have children, and she has a baby boy. We had a baby, it's a boy. She named him Joseph, which means the Lord adds, or may the Lord add. Joseph was born, and this is very important. Joseph was born at a time when his father, Jacob, was a much older man, and Joseph was born to his dad's favorite wife, and so he was immediately and automatically the favorite son. God did add another son to Rachel, but she died while giving birth to him. And as she was dying, she named him Ben-Oni, which means son of my trouble. But Jacob came along and renamed him Benjamin, which means son of my right hand. And we're going to address this a little bit later because it does come into play. But a major contributing factor into the dysfunction of this ancient biblical family was that Joseph's dad, Jacob, Israel, he was a very passive father. When his only daughter at the time, Dinah, was raped, Jacob did nothing about it, which forced her brothers to take matters into their own hands. Her brothers, you might remember, they devised a plan that allowed them to slaughter all the men in that city where the rape took place. When Jacob heard about what they had done to retaliate, he was angry, but he was not mad about what had been done to his daughter, and he was not mad about the slaughter of innocent people. He was concerned mostly about his PR, his public relations in the land. There was another time when Jacob discovered that his firstborn son, Reuben, had committed incest with one of his wives, Bilhah. What did Jacob do about it? Nothing. He did nothing about it, at least at the time. However, when Jacob was dying and his sons were brought in for his blessing, he didn't give much of a blessing to Reuben. He basically said, hey man, you're wild and reckless. You committed a shameful act way back when, and because of this, you're not going to excel. You're not going to have the honor and power as the firstborn should. And I'm thinking, Jerry, it's about to get crazy up in here. This was the family that Joseph was born into. He did not have a choice as to the family that he was born into. It's like, welcome to Crazy Town. Good luck, buddy. And from this little bit of a background, I think we begin to understand the deception and the rivalry and the jealousy and the anger and rebellion within the ranks of Jacob's boys. And as we turn to our text in Genesis chapter 37, we understand, and I think in some ways we're not surprised about what is going to happen to Joseph. Turn with me in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 37. And we're going to start reading with verse 2. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph. Oh, is it about Jacob or Joseph? Yes. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age. And so he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream. And this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. A lot of moving parts in this passage of Scripture, but I want to start with some obvious things first. First of all, Joseph's dad, Jacob, Israel, he does nothing. He does absolutely nothing to hide his favoritism. He is blatant about it. And then it looks like this trifecta of Joseph unwisely flaunting his privilege. Number one, he comes back with a bad report about his brothers. The honeymoon crashers, my 10-year-old and 6-year-old, don't even get me started on tattling. Right? It seems like Joseph might be tattling on his older brothers. And we don't know what the bad report was. We don't know if Joseph tried, to soften the blow, maybe a little sandwich criticism. Well, they're doing some good things with the flocks, but they did lose some sheep. All we know is that it was a bad report. Number two, he receives this sweet robe. This really sweet robe. What does mine say? Sweet. What does mine say? Dude. What does mine say? Sweet. What does mine? Dude. Right? This was not a robe for working. It would be like wearing a tuxedo to do yard work. Think about that. Oh, thanks for getting dressed up. Jeff, I got your call yesterday about the mowing of the grass. Would you ever wear a tuxedo to cut the grass? Okay. He receives this robe. And these robes were like a sign of nobility. And I think by giving it to Joseph, his dad was basically saying, you can wear this beautiful garment because you don't have to work like your brothers anymore. And later we do see that Joseph, he rocks the robe. And then number three, the dreams. It seems like our boy Joe can't wait to tell his brothers about his dreams. Hey guys, listen to this, check this out. I don't think Joseph really understood everything that was happening in his life at that moment in time. I probably would have done the same. I do think it is funny that his dad gave him the robe and was like, "You're my favorite, Joe. You're my boy, Blue." And then he was like, "Hold up. That whole sun and moon and 11 stars, you're talking about me and your mom? You might want to ease up, big boy." I think most of us would have acted similar to Joseph if we were in that position. I mean, I don't know. I have one older brother, and that's enough rivalry and competition to deal with. We're talking 10 older brothers for Joseph. The commentary writer, James Smith, he says that Joseph was at the very least naive and at the very worst self-centered and arrogant. Joseph was either
really naive, or at the very worst, self-centered and arrogant. We do know that from the text that we just read, this trifecta, this bad report, the robe, and the dreams, that Joseph's brothers came to despise their younger brother so much that they couldn't even speak a kind word to him. I want you to try to imagine the mounting pressure in that house. Someone is going to lose it and go off. Someone's going to pick up a chair and throw it. If I hear one more word about a dream, I am going to go off. Let's continue reading in the text. Verse 12. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them." "Very well," Joseph replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Sounds like a terrible idea. Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "They have moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, probably because of that ornate robe. And before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him, and let's throw him into one of these pits, one of these cisterns, and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. This pit was empty, and there was no water in it. And I am thinking, what in the world was Joseph's dad thinking? Was Jacob totally oblivious to the situation? Could he not see the hatred and jealousy within his own household? How could he not sense any danger into which he was sending his favorite son? And also, Joseph, come on, bro. There should be like a red flag, like a warning alert, like this is not a good assignment, Dad. Can you send one of your servants? Look at the hostility. As soon as they saw Joseph coming, his brother's immediate reaction was, "It's the dreamer, let's kill him." And Reuben, the eldest, who was not known for his character, is the one who steps in and tries to save his brother. I want you to also notice the first thing that they do. What is the first thing that they do? They go for the robe. That's right. They don't push him around. They don't rough him up. They don't land some punches. They don't torture him. They strip him of this hated symbol of favoritism. It was the first thing to go. And after they take the robe and they throw him into the pit, what's the next thing they do? We didn't read that far, but what's the next thing they do? They sat down. The very next verse says they sat down and ate a meal. They were hangry. And it appears that there is no guilt. There's no shame among them. Let's kill Joseph. No, let's throw him in a pit and let him die a lonely and slow death. Now, let's eat. I'm starving. I want you to picture his brothers eating with Joseph's cries in the background. This is our first stop on the Tour de Joseph, the pit. And I want you to think, in your own journey, have you ever been thrown into a pit? Have you ever been abandoned by your dysfunctional family? Have you ever been stabbed in the back because of your siblings' bitterness and envy? Have you ever been in a pit because of factors and circumstances that were out of your control? It is a horrible feeling. Joseph had no control over being born into this crazy family. He had no control over being his dad's favorite or his dad giving him this robe in the first place. I guess he could have chose to not wear the robe, but that would bring his dad so much shame.
right? He could have kept his mouth shut about the dreams, but I want you to think about it. This teenager ends up in a literal pit. A literal pit. I have a picture here. Do any of you know who this woman is? This is baby Jessica. You guys remember baby Jessica and her family in the background? A little over 30 years ago, in October of 1987, the world was transfixed by the story of baby Jessica McClure, the 18-month-old toddler who fell 22 feet down into a very small well in her aunt's backyard in Texas. It took 58 hours with no food or water before she was finally brought back to the surface. And there was cheers from the rescuers and families all across the country. I know our family had it on the television. Baby Jessica accidentally fell into a pit, and she became a household name. Joseph's brief stay in a pit, it changes the entire course of his life. I want us to finish reading chapter 37. Verse 25. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the pit and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Check it out to see whether it's your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Does it make you feel a little uneasy? A little uneasy when you read about what Joseph's brothers did to him? Like the flood in Genesis chapters 6 and 7, I always thought it was a little strange when Joseph, in the coat of many colors, was taught to the children in junior church as this is a happy kid's story. No, it's not. When they see an opportunity to make money off of their brother, they say, "Well, let's not kill him. I mean, after all, he is our brother. Instead, let's make some cash money by selling him into slavery." With family like that, who needs enemies? In an instant, Joseph, he went from favored son to lowly, helpless slave. But I want you to notice God's providence and his timing, moving and working behind the scenes. Who was Joseph sold to in Egypt? Potiphar, yeah. And Lord willing, that's where we're going to pick up next week. On the back of your bulletins, you're going to see some application and takeaway points. And it's going to focus on Joseph and also focus on his dysfunctional family. I think, first of all, there is a lesson in here for all of us about being passive. Not passive-aggressive, even though that's not good, but just straight up passive. Like I mentioned earlier, Joseph's father, Jacob, he was a passive father. He stood by several times when he should have stepped up and taken action. I looked up some synonyms for the word passive, and I found
apathetic, uninvolved, indifferent, asleep, hands off. Listen, we have got to avoid passivity. When we notice that things aren't as they ought to be, we should consider what we can do about it. And sometimes there's nothing that can be done, or there's nothing that we can do, but other times there is some course of action that we should take. To know that we should do something that is within our ability to do and then not do it, that is sinful. Who is going to step in and fight injustice? Who's going to stand up for the homeless in our community? Who is going to pay it forward like Mr. Brandon preached about last week? Yeah, I understand we all can't be foster parents, but who is going to be the voice for orphans in our city? As a father, Jacob did many things that he should not have done, and he didn't do many things that he should have. God is sovereign and he is in control, but he is not controlling. We are responsible for our decisions. And we have got to realize that the decisions that we make, they not only affect us, but they affect the people who care about us. And like we've talked about before, they affect the people who come after us. The course of actions that we choose or fail to choose will affect our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren and our great-great-grandchildren. Isaac's mistakes with his kids and Jacob's mistakes with his kids had tragic long-term effects. But with God's help, we can be active. We can even be proactive, which is the first of the 7 habits of highly effective people. We can be proactive rather than passive and reactionary. Speaking of choices, Jacob chose to show favoritism among his sons. He was in a season of his life where his favorite wife, Rachel, could have children, and he chose to love Joseph the most. And we all know the damage that is done by playing favorites. We have got to avoid favoritism, especially moms and dads. When you show favoritism, it is destructive. For the longest time, my brother called me the golden child. He really felt like our parents loved me the most and that they gave me special privileges. For example, when I was in high school, I grew my hair out really long. At the time, it was called a skater cut, shaved on the sides and in the back, and then long ponytail on the top. I think that's come back, but nowadays it's called the man bun. We're going to go with skater cut. Sounds better than man bun. Well, my brother, when he was in high school, mom and dad apparently wouldn't let him grow his hair out. And so when I was in high school and I had the long ponytail, it was like Joseph's robe. Every time he saw it, oh, mom and dad never let me grow my hair out. Well, I'm sorry, bro, that you're still holding on to that. Really? Build a bridge and get over it, dude. Good grief. Becky's the baby, and she's the only girl, and you think I'm the favorite? Hello? Our dad's philosophy, it was the same as the lyrics. There's an Avett Brothers song called Murder in the City, and I want to share some lyrics because I had conversations with my dad, and this is how he felt. The Avett Brothers, Scott and Seth Avett, they have a band. One of my favorites, you should check them out. I wonder which brother is better, which one our parents loved the most. I sure did get in lots of trouble. They seemed to let the other go. A tear fell from my father's eyes. I wonder what my dad would say. He said, I love you and I'm proud of you both in so many different ways. Moms and dads, one of the quickest ways to exasperate your children, one of the fastest ways to embitter your children is by having favorites. Avoid it. James 2:1 tells us that it is a sin. It is sinful to show favoritism. And just like a hairstyle creating bitterness and jealousy, something else that jumps out at me in this account in the Bible is the danger of anger and jealousy. In our English language, the word anger is very, very close to danger. Anger is one letter away from danger. And Scripture warns us about harboring resentment and anger in our hearts. When we do that, we give the devil some room to do his thing. When we do that, we give the devil some room to work. And I know a lot of our experiences in our lives results in anger. And I think God gives us the ability to feel anger for a reason. It's a sign that something isn't right and needs to be addressed. But God does not want us to allow anger to remain in us and begin to simmer until we reach a boiling point. And guess what? Usually what needs to be addressed, that thing that needs to be addressed, is our own hearts. When we don't deal with anger properly, it has the ability to explode and destroy everything precious to us. But with God's help, we can honestly address what it is that's making us so angry. And with the Lord's help, we can move to a place of forgiveness rather than allowing anger to destroy us and others. Jealousy, it's another serious heart issue. What is the remedy? What is the solution to jealousy? It's one word, starts with a C, ends with elaborate. Celebrate. Celebrate. Celebrate that good thing with that person. Don't hate, celebrate. Hey, bro, I like your man bun. Hey, bro, sweet robe. Maybe you'll let me borrow it sometime. Oh, it's not my size? No worries. Hey, little brother, that's a fascinating dream that you had. How about we keep our eyes open and see how the Lord works in our lives? Don't allow jealousy to completely blind you in your journey as you seek God and you seek His righteousness. I think the biggest application that stands out to me is that we are all called to be faithful regardless of our family situation. And that's hard. That's tough. We are called to be faithful regardless of our family situation. And the truth is, there are no perfect families. There are no perfect church families. Yes, some families are healthier than others, but none are perfect. And ultimately, God holds us accountable for ourselves. He doesn't hold us accountable for the families that we are born into. Yes, I might have to deal with my mom and dad's baggage and their brokenness that has been passed down, for generations, but in the end, I am responsible for my faith. I am responsible for trusting that God is faithful. One of the psychologists that I worked with at the Children's Hospital when I was eating a lot of Hot Pockets, his name was Dr. Taylor. And on the weekends, he preached. He was a pastor at a Baptist church there in Stanton, Virginia. Fascinating guy. His name is James Taylor, Dr. James Taylor. Sweet name. He didn't play the guitar. He had a great approach with these teenagers that we were working directly with, these broken teenagers who had parents abandon them when they were young, or they were beat by their alcoholic fathers. They were raped and abused as small children, literally having gone through hell on earth. You address the suffering. You work through the pain and the hurt while taking responsibility for your current actions or inaction. Having been hurt does not give you the right to hurt others. Jenny and I recently watched the movie I, Tonya, about Tonya Harding. Man, she had a crazy, rough family situation growing up. No family is perfect. I think about Jesus and his half-brothers and sisters as his family. He can empathize. God understands our circumstances. God understands our family situation, and He wants to help us rise above any negative influences that may have come into our lives from our family or from elsewhere. And here's the truth. God specializes in changing us and conforming us into his image, regardless of our family situation, regardless of what has happened to us or what we have done. God can bring healing and forgiveness into our lives so that we can start over at any point. I am so thankful. I am so thankful that God has the power to enable us to be faithful and break this cycle regardless of our family situation. Something else that's not on the back of your bulletins, but I want to throw it out there as we wrap up with today's lesson. Being in the pit, it usually feels longer than it really is. Have you ever noticed that? When you're right in the thick of it, in a season of trial and suffering, maybe a chapter of unfair hostility, and your world is falling apart, oftentimes it feels like it's never going to end. But looking back in the grand picture, like Joseph, you really weren't in that pit very long. God will use the different pits in our lives. And if you're currently in a pit right now, or maybe you're having a hard time getting over how you were treated during that specific season, I want to encourage you this morning to come back to the lobby. We're going to sing a song that's called Desert Song. Come back to the lobby and let's pray together. Let's encourage each other. Let's spur each other on to seek God and his timing while in the pit. All of my life, in every season, you are still God. And so I have a reason to sing. I have a reason to worship. Let's stand and sing.